guys, this is Doug. Welcome back to the Danger Planet. Today, Brendan and I are going to do our second episode on Kumon's Song of Ice and Fire, and today we're going to be talking about the political track. Welcome back. I am here with Mr. Brendan. Brendan, why don't you say hi?
Hello.
And this is our second episode on Song of Ice and Fire. We have already done an introduction episode to the game system in general, kind of our high-level thoughts about why we like to play the game. But today we wanted to focus in specifically on a fairly unique element of the game system, and that's actually the political track. So Brendan is going to walk you guys through what is the political track, how does it play out during, regular gameplay, what does each symbol within the political track represent, and what does it do? And then we're kind of going to close out here with some common ways that different factions utilize the political track during the game, and what you could maybe expect out of a Lannister player, what you might expect out of a Stark player, what you might expect out of a Greyjoy, and so on and so forth. So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. Brendan, why don't you tell the people just kind of in general what the political track is, the different elements that make it up. Let's start at the beginning here, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So basically what the political track is it represents like the behind the scenes machinations of like your political characters sort of influence on, either, back home and the political to and fro of the Game of Thrones sort of IP,
the
or
politics of Westeros.
Yeah, the politics of Westeros.
Yeah.
There's 5 different tactics zones basically, or 5 different zones on the board itself for like the core board. There are certain things that add extra zones, but that's probably for another video or probably later another time probably. But each one basically has its own core mechanics, and then as Doug sort of alluded to, some factions sort of look to either have certain zones themselves, or in one particular instance, one faction sort of gets extra bonuses if your opponent owns certain zones. So it's a very integral part of the game, as we probably I know that we covered it, but as we covered it in the first video, it's definitely a very integral part of the game overall, and knowing how to like use this board effectively definitely has a very big impact on your on the like the battle board
on the gameplay. I think an important thing to call out here for folks that are just getting into Song of Ice and Fire is that the game in general is always alternating activations. You as the player need to choose whether or not you're going to activate an NPC that will go onto the political board, or a unit on the actual battlefield, and those choices happen in tandem. So you as the player are electing which unit to trigger, and you're having to make choices between both your onboard units and the units that are your NPCs or your political track units. And oftentimes you might have somewhere between 4 to 5 to 6 units on the board, and then somewhere between, I don't know, I would normal numbers like 1
anywhere
to 3.
between anywhere at least 2 to 3 is what you should shoot for.
So you talked a little bit about, and I think this is important, you talked a little bit about kind of the different sections of the board, and my understanding, I don't know what they're specifically called, but I call them the crown, the purse, the letter, the sword, and the horse.
Yep. I mean, that's pretty much what the whole community really refers to, but they do have technical names that I never use as well.
I was actually looking those up and I couldn't find them. I was really funny. I was like, how do I not know the actual names for these? All right, so why don't we just go through in order really quickly what each symbol does. And I guess before we get to that, I mean, I touched on it a little bit, but effectively the way that you use your NPCs to interact with this political board is that when it is your turn to activate either a model or an NPC, you may take an NPC and place that NPC on one of these 5 slots on the board. So that would either be putting them on the crown or the purse or the swords or the horse. And effectively what you would do is you would proc that activation of that ability. Sometimes particular NPCs will have special affinities for special zones, or have special effects when they hit special zones. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in the specific sub-faction. But why don't we walk through, I guess we'll start with the crown, right? So the
Yep.
crown says one enemy unit must take a panic test and suffers -1 to their roll. So why
Yep.
don't you give us just a very high level about kind of how that plays out on the game?
Yeah. So I mean, so basically, what the crown sort of represents is sort of the political manipulation and subterfuge, sort of like intimidation tactics, whatever, what have you, if you want to think of it from a lore sense. And basically, what it does is it causes your opponent or a targeted unit of your opponents on the battlefield to take what's called a panic check. And basically what a panic check is basically sort of in synopsis a leadership check that can if you fail cause models from your units to basically flee the battlefield. So it's just an extra way to get damage in, and then depending on your sort of your build, the build of your faction or the build of your opponent's faction, this can be sort of mitigated either way based on buffs or debuffs to certain morale.
TLDR, the Lannisters love the crown. And a big thing about this game to keep in mind, guys, is that wounds caused by failed leadership checks are the equivalent of mortal wounds in like an AOS system or non-savable wounds. So those are very significant ways to do damage. They punch through and ignore armor in every capacity, and all saves they just apply wounds to the unit. So then the next one, also a Lannister favorite, is the purse.
I think this one's sort of everyone's
favorite.
Yeah. Basically, the next zone is called the wealth zone, and basically what it does, it represents like your house, sort of like, or your army sort of bringing reinforcements back onto the battlefield, or like paying people off to be there, mercenaries, whatever, what have you. But basically what the zone itself does is when you claim the zone, you restore up to 3 wounds to a single unit, and on that same unit, if they have a condition token, which there are certain condition tokens that can cause debuffs to your units that's placed by your opponent's effects or your own effects in some instances, and you can remove that token from the unit as well. So it's basically like a restoration zone, and because
it's a heal proc. It's a heal proc and a condition removal proc, basically.
And what you got to think about it though is that, like, because units are fixed size of basically 12 wounds for infantry anyway, which is probably your most common unit for the game, that's basically almost a full third of your entire unit's health getting restored. So.
And also a big thing about this is that units will often, the amount of damage they do will be dictated on how healthy the unit is. So if you have a unit that is lost, maybe it's 3rd rank, getting that 3rd rank populated back so that you can hit at a higher power is a really big deal in this game.
Yeah, it's a really big deal, especially, and I think we did touch base on in the first video, because the dice pool is so small comparative to like other basically tabletop war games for your units, like attacks. Any sort of shift, either
is a big deal.
The positives or negatives is usually like a big swing.
Or any reroll, either forced reroll by your opponent or a reroll where you get to do it for good things. It's a big freaking deal. It's not like 40k, guys. You're not rolling 40 to 50 dice at a time. I mean, you might be rolling
at max 10,
maybe at most. A lot of times less than that, like 6, 7, 8 dice like that. So rerolls and alterations to that are a big deal. So then the next one we got, I don't even know what to call this section. I just call it the letter or the love letter. It says draw 2. So draw 2 tactics cards and place any one condition on an enemy unit. So this one is quite the shift from the purse. It does 2 big things, right? It lets you draw tactics cards, which are going to be dictated by your leader and also your faction, right? That's a combination of your leader and your faction, which are kind of like your special abilities. So that's a really, really important resource. And then it does the flip of what the purse does, where it allows you to place a condition on any enemy unit. And so what we just talked about here, where like weaken or any condition like that, where it would force your opponent to do a reroll of say they saved a bunch of hits, being able to force them to do a reroll can be really significant, especially like we talked about, if you can knock away those the ranks. So anything else on that? What is this thing called? Is it? I just call it the love letter.
It's called it. Are you ready for this? You're gonna love it. I can taste your anticipation already. It's called the Tactics Zone
Oh,
because you draw tactics cards from it.
aptly named. Aptly named.
Very aptly named. Yeah,
s-
and I mean, and I think probably in the vacuum of like all of these zones, I put this zone probably pretty high
Gives you a lot of
because
resources.
yeah, it's a lot of resources. Drawing Taxes cards is especially important because you gotta, you really, especially if you're digging for a specific card that you need for a combo that you're trying to set up, it's very important because outside of basically at the end of the round you can pitch cards to draw up to your minimum hand size, guys. That's part of the sort of the cleanup phase of the game. Outside of that, there's no way to draw cards.
Yeah, there's not a lot of ways to draw cards.
There's not a lot of way to draw cards. So if you don't take it, your opponent's definitely going to take it. It's probably one of the more contested zones on the board outside of probably the purse and the next zone that we're going to be covering. So
if this was Magic the Gathering, I would refer to this zone as Value Town. This zone this zone is Value Town. It's really good almost all the time. You don't even need like that cha-ching when you place your boyo there.
Yeah.
So combat zone. This one's pretty simple. It says a friendly unit may make a free attack action. So I mean, tell us what you think on this one. But my take on it, after playing, probably a dozen games or so of the system, is that it's another way to punch out or to pump out really, really, really a higher number of attacks through a really high DPS unit. Or if you've got a unit that you're right about to clear and you want to make sure that you can clear that unit and pick it off the board, you might go after this one. Sometimes I've gone after it against you when we're playing to deny you this actually.
Yes.
And I think that's a big thing that I think we should talk about, quite frankly, that we haven't touched on yet, where just like you can go after these resources to proc for yourself, sometimes if you're playing really tricksy, you might know that your opponent would rely on these for a particular thing or a particular function or a particular synergy. So there's a lot to be said about counterplay on the political track itself as well. So Brendan, I know I threw a lot on the table there, but why don't you give us your TLDR on the Sword Z zone and also talk a little bit about kind of counterplay.
Yeah. So first I would like to say that I have never heard somebody call it the combat zone ever in my life. I've always called it the swords. But even though it's called the, people refer to it as like the sword zone or whatever, what have you. It is also nice to note that what it says is one friendly unit may make a free attack action. That doesn't necessarily have, and this happens with newer players, that doesn't necessarily mean a melee attack. So you can claim this zone. Yep, you can claim this zone and use it to do a free ranged attack action if you have a ranged attack option on some of your units. And it's a big tempo swing sort of thing, right? Because when you claim the zone and you target one of your units, you're giving them that free attack action, which is great, but you're also not using that unit's activation either. So if that unit survives the swing back on your opponent, you also get to swing again. So it just exponentially gets that damage pump out onto your opponent.
It compounds on itself very quickly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's like very few instances where like if your first activation on a round, unless you don't have any engaged units, where you wouldn't want to take this zone, really, unless you were like like Doug was saying, like if a particular faction card needs this zone for a specific trigger and you're basically trying to deny that zone from your opponent, that's the only other instance. And I think that's sort of like a higher level of play where, when I'm looking at the political track, it's interesting. I find myself when I'm playing not so much worrying about what I need per se, but what I am denying from my opponent.
Yeah.
Unless I like really desperately need something to go in my favor off a certain zone to get something that I really need, that's like sort of like a unit dying or whatever, what have you. I'm more often using the political zone to block my opponent's effects out because of that, again, and I'm going to harp on this on pretty much every video, because of the size of the game and the pools of dice that are being used. Any sort of advantage that you can get over your opponent or just by denying your opponent, you got to think of that as essentially debuffing their units. Like you are in essence, without like literally rolling dice, protecting your own units with your own sort of save by being sort of proactive on the political board of denying what your opponent wants.
Yeah, I think the biggest one, quite frankly, the one that I've the one zone on the political board that I've tried to play takeaway the most is actually Horsey, which reads one friendly unit may make a free maneuver or retreat action, and I do this a lot because the lists that I play are very heavy with Lannister halberdiers, very heavy with the Lannister like sword and shield guys, like the guardsmen, and I'm usually playing a game of try to get to the objectives as quick as possible, tar pit them, keep my opponent away from me. So I don't want my opponents to have extra moves, especially because I play against you a lot, and you are a Baratheon boy, and so you move real slow, but you hit real hard. So denying the movement to you, especially on turns 1 and 2.
Keep me slow.
Yeah, exactly. Turns 1 and 2, denying that movement is very, very, very important. So specifically when we've played my Lannisters versus your Baratheons, if I'm not going after the crown or say the purse, I'm probably going after the horse, to be honest. So why don't we, I mean, I think this is any bits of knowledge on the Horsey before we go into?
You pretty much nailed it. I mean, basically all it does is it gives you some free agency, just like the combat zone does, right? Getting your positioning ready. Maybe you need to reposition a unit to make sure they have line of sight so that when you do activate the unit, they can get a charge off on the unit that you want. It's sort of a zone that's also, ironically compounded with the use of cavalry units, because when cavalry units, most of them, when they perform a maneuver action, not when they activate, but when you perform a maneuver action, they get a free maneuver action before resolving that action. So like if you take this zone, you do the free cav maneuver, then do this zone's maneuver, and then you activate the unit and you happen to maneuver again, like the exponential movement of that unit being able to basically like run around, probably in a worst case scenario, run around an entire infantry unit and expose their rear flank is like a very bad situation to be in. And I mean, in moving forward, I think if I were just looking at these 5 zones, probably in a vacuum, not incorporating like any sort of cards or anything else, I think I would probably put the tactics zone number 1, the combat zone number 2, maybe 3, and then probably it's tied there with the maneuver zone, the healing zone number 4, and then just again, based on a complete vacuum of what the abilities do, just face value, probably the crown as being the weakest number 5. And again, that ranking can change based on how you've built your army to interact with those zones or the political characters that you take, but I think that's probably my ranking,
which I think is fair. And I think the only caveat is a caveat that you've already pointed out here, which is, hey, very high level in a vacuum, here's where they are. But keep in mind, right, the second that you actually put this into practice, things will immediately change. So like
greatly,
I actually think a good example of this is, why don't we start from a faction overview standpoint, talk a little bit about the Lannisters, I guess, because this is the one where I'll probably be able to be the most helpful. I mean, these guys, what Brendan just said is true. The crown in general is often probably a lower level priority, but if you're playing against a Lannister player and they have things like red cloaks or other things like that, basically denying the crown to them is a huge deal, because a lot of their synergies and buffs rely around controlling that piece for additional leverage. So Brendan, why don't you give us a little bit of a high level on kind of some of the specific units or things that the Lannisters like to do on the board? If you're playing against a Lannister, what are they often going to go after? What are the key units here for them?
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of interesting, at least from a Lannister standpoint. I mean, as Doug sort of pointed out, there's a couple units and their faction deck and attachments, predominantly out of the Kingsguard, that check for you controlling the crown to get additional buffs. And then realistically, it's also extra interesting because you also have access to Joffrey as a non-combat unit, and
Which will just
while
give you the crown.
expensive, he also reads like, you know, you always, as long as he's on the board, you count. I believe it's while he's on the board, you always count as controlling the crown, even if it's completely open or your opponent has taken away from you, which is a very powerful ability to have. But he is sort of a big point sink just to make sure that you have that, right?
Yeah, he's a pricey boy.
Yeah, so I mean, and then off just basically like the general tactics deck, you know, you're gonna want the crown itself, and especially because of how your vengeance card works, which I believe is called a Lannister always pays his debts or something to that effect. Which, you know, I referenced it as a vengeance card, but like every like at least every first and second wave faction has a card that reads like, when a friendly faction infantry or cavalry unit is destroyed, trigger this card, and it basically gives a permanent buff to like whatever unit it's played on after a friendly unit has been destroyed. And then if you control a particular zone associated with that card, and then with the Lannisters it's the crown, they get a buff to their panic checks, and then I also believe a +1 flat to their attacks. So I mean, that's a predominantly like very powerful ability, which also sort of like screws you if you happen to actually like take tempo on the battlefield itself. And then generally like a Lannister player will really like to take the tactics zone from you. I don't think there's a single faction that doesn't want the tactics zone, but
everybody wants that.
But you know, just off like just going off the faction decks themselves, Lannisters really want this zone because while they're infantry units, for the exception of, you know, some more than others, red cloaks, cough cough, they generally don't have a lot of punching power. But your political characters and your your tactics decks the cards are extremely powerful. Lannisters are one of the I think the only, I'll have to double check on that, but I believe they are still the only faction that has a hard like counter spell in their base deck. They just have a card that says, play this card, roll a die on a 3-up. Your opponent's card that they tried to trigger is dispelled.
I think it's a 4-up natty, but if you have Tyrion, it's a 3-up. I think, or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But yeah, basically, if you well, he lets you search.
I think there's a reroll, maybe.
Yeah, or there's a reroll or something. But if you have him, he lets you search it. He lets you proc it, and he lets you like pull it out of your deck, which is crazy.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, that's a good. I think we're gonna do more specific overviews and more deeper dives on all this stuff, folks. So we're just trying to give you a little bit of a taste right now. So at a high level, that's kind of how the Lannisters operate. Where do you want to go next? I mean, we got 6 other.
Yeah, I mean, so generally, like, I can speak from like the Baratheon standpoint. Baratheons really like to also have the tactics zone and the crown zone as well. Even though predominantly our cards don't really work, like our units don't interact with the crown that well unless you're like building like the like a Stannis faith build, but the effects that we get off of our cards off having these zones are very powerful. Like for instance, our sort of one base deck like power pump card called ours is the Fury, basically gives a target friendly unit, when it's making a melee attack, this list of buffs that you can give it. You can pick 1 out of 3, and then if you control the tactic zone and or the crown zone, you can pick an additional one. So if you control both, you get all 3, and then you play it on that unit's attack basically get a armor piercing buff, a to hit buff of +1, and then also a panic buff for when your opponent has to make that panic save at the right before the end of the attack sequence. So it really like pumps like could be like a really crappy like 5-point unit all the way through to like basically hitting like a 6 or a 7-point unit.
Yeah.
And
then I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I was basically just going to move into, how we were talking about how like these two factions are sort of looking for these specific zones for them to control. Probably the one that I'm most familiar with the Greyjoys is that fact that the Greyjoys sort of interestingly also do that, but they actually get more buffs from their cards if your opponent controls certain
Yeah, which is
zones.
wild. That's crazy.
Yeah. So like basically if a couple of their cards check if your opponent has the wealth or the combat zones or both, they get exponentially bigger buffs than if they had just controlled them themselves. So it's kind of this weird like cat and mouse game of like, oh, like I'll get to fight with my unit for free, but like what am I giving him in return? Like basically they have cards that basically read like if your opponent controls like one of these zones, you get to heal and attack instead of just only like healing. So
Yeah.
it's stuff like that where it gets like knowing your opponent's deck is almost sort of like more important than knowing your own, because your own deck is like very straightforward. It's not really like the tactics cards aren't like super difficult to understand. They prompt you when you can play them. They give a pretty basic effect overall. It's not like, in 40K where you need to use these stratagems in a specific trigger that like you can very easily miss if you're sort of playing at like a higher level, but you have them physically in front of you. And so knowing your matchups and knowing what the other person can do off triggers off this board is something that I think is almost more important than like knowing your own cards.
Yeah, and
which is
it
a
goes
very weird thing to say
it
out
goes
loud, but
it goes back to what we talked about, which is interestingly enough, the Greyjoys really play into that mechanic of being able to deny your opponent's resources on the political board, or just in general react to what your opponent is doing on the political board. And the Greyjoys, I agree with you 100%, more than any other faction, they really reward being able to understand what your opponent is trying to do on the political board and then profit off of that effectively.
Be a sneaky Viking Raider guy.
Be a sneaky boyo. Pay the iron price, or I guess make them pay the iron price, I guess. And then really quickly, I would say it sounds a little bit like a no-brainer, and this is a very surface level take, but Targaryens like horses. Any cav, and really just even outside of factions, any cav-based army that's all about moving really quickly with smaller size units is going to really love that horse.
Free folk love the horse.
Yeah, and free folk love the horse as well. So expect to see folks out of that. Honestly, I don't have too much. I don't think I've played a Night's Watch player since their nerf. What's your take on the Night's Watch scenario? Have you run into too many Night's Watch players?
I haven't, which is actually why I'm so particularly interested that one of the guys at our local game store picked them up, because I want to sort of get more reps against them, because I'm being very honest, I don't really know what they try and like look for. I don't think they even really like look for controlling certain zones, because their cards are sort of based around like oaths, which is sort of like their specific like faction card, which is sort of like permanent buffs to certain units that you can sort of combo on each other.
Right, and the older lists were comboing onto those really strong range War Machine units.
Yeah, or the like the Jon Snow sort of death ball.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
He doesn't know. He knows nothing, but he does know that like you can't kill him. So
yeah, he does know that he ain't dying. He knows that at least.
Yeah.
So then I guess the last two, I mean, one of them is very new, but then do we want to mention the Starks at all?
So the Starks generally look for while they don't like particularly use maneuverability extremely well, like not especially well outside of like other factions, they do get bonus like charge buffs from controlling the maneuver zone, as well as controlling the combat zone, so keeping them off those two zones can definitely help you mitigate some of their tactics card power, but I mean outside of that they're not really like predominantly looking for trying to get agency on any of the other zones that anyone else wouldn't also be looking for. They could not care less about the crown zone, honestly.
Yeah.
They
So
don't really do panic.
Starks strike me as good value, all around faction. You know, kind of use the political board contextually as them. Try to see what your opponent's doing, if relevant, block it. Other than that, just like make good decisions when playing the game. That's my take on them.
Yeah, they're playing which is also sort of like big brain, also thematic for them.
Right.
It's
just
like
make good decisions.
Just like, hey man, I'm here to play an honest war game, and you're just like, whoa, man. That's kind of war. I don't like that.
That's crazy. What's your superpower?
Crazy.
Being very reasonable and providing good value on stats to my employer. So then the last one is a little bit of an oddball. I haven't even played a game against Martells yet because they're brand new, but we did have 4 different people at our LGS, including 2 of my buddies, pick up the Martells. So I'm going to run into them a lot now. Do you have any take? I don't have anything on these guys. I've barely read through the rules. I haven't played a game against them. So what's your...
I mean, so it's interesting because like with them, there's they're one of the only 2 factions outside of Targaryens that also bring their own zone to the tactics board. So that also like completely changes the game for like what agencies you're sort of looking for in terms of activation counts and everything like that.
Do you find that they have a higher number of NPCs because of that?
No, but it does mean that like, so in a game where if you're playing against your opponent and you both have 3 political characters, always the person who is going second isn't going to be able to activate their last character. But if an extra zone is added, then
there's 6.
Then you do.
Yeah,
and then
5.
Dependent on what the sort of like what the to and fro is between the 2 factions, that sort of changes like what zones on the board you want to take, or like which characters you're going to activate in which sequence. It's also interesting because also there's a way for the Martells to kill your opponent's political characters.
Wild. That's like so crazy.
So they basically influence a zone on the board, and then like if a character is on that zone in the board for too long, they get murked, which is a crazy thing because of how impactful the political board is, and the fact that it also dumps your activation count. So like you can't like be using your politicals, because usually how the to and fro of a game goes is that you activate, or at least in the way that I play is I try and activate out my political characters the first thing relatively early to try and bait my opponent out of like activating one of their combat units before I have to activate mine, so I don't have to worry about that unit swinging back at me like later on where my units might have taken some damage.
I think it's also a good thing to point out here is that that's a particularly good strategy for a Baratheon player, because Baratheons they're hardy, they can take a lot of hits. They're really substantial in terms of staying power.
And generally my tactics deck is reactive anyway.
Right,
it's not a proactive deck.
So you're going out there and applying pressure on the political track saying, I'm going to take these, or on the flip side, I'm going to take these away from you early.
Correct.
What you got, basically. Come and hit me like you can. I'm still going to be here.
Yeah, and I'll still be able to play my cards. Whereas like a player with like a Stark player, a couple of their cards read like, when performing a charge, you can re-roll the die if you control the maneuver zone, stuff like that. That's, while very helpful in terms of like, getting in there and making those
specific triggers
charges, it's specific triggers. And like, if you're already like engaged if your entire front line is engaged, like that's a dead card.
It's a dead card. Yeah.
Whereas
I've seen you when we've played, there's been so many times where you just like, you have this shit-eating grin on your face, and like we're into turn 3, and then all of a sudden you dump like 5 cards at once, and I'm like, oh my god, what's happening?
Yeah, and then I draw through, and I and then I draw at the end of the turn, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm trying to, a really big point, and again, this might be something that we discussed really later, is that with the tactics cards, you want to try and you don't want to hold them for too long, because again, outside of this tactic zone, there's no really way for you to draw more outside of maybe like if you have a political character that allows you to, or stuff like that. So making sure that you're getting the most value out of the cards that you're seeing, or just, even though, you know, this is, again, it's something with newer players, is that like, oh, like I really like this card and I like to hold on to it, and it's like, yeah, but is it providing you any value right now?
Yeah, you should be looking for,
because if it isn't, then you should probably get rid of it.
Yeah, and that's different than in like what I've experienced in Malifaux. Like a lot of high level play is all about sitting on cards forever,
Right.
and then using them at the exact right moment. Whereas this one, it's like, if it's not good, I mean, probably just flush it and try to redraw like to something that's usable in the moment, right? Or at least next turn.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this was a great overview of the political track. I mean, quite frankly, when I started this game, the political track is one of the most unique elements to Song as a miniatures game.
I mean, I don't think there's a single other miniatures game that's doing something like this.
Right. It creates a dual track system where you need to be aware of what's happening in both of these areas, and if you're not going to be very good at this game. So
and it also just perpetuates the thing that I sort of impart on newer players and players who have been playing for like a little bit, is that like the game in and of itself is super easy to pick up. Like none of the words on any of those zones are like super hard to understand, but the depth of learning when to do when in response to what, it's like that's where like the learning curve comes in. Like it's very easy to play. I could teach someone how to play the full game in probably like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, because they're learning and they'll like understand anything that's going on for any of the rest of their games. But the learning curve comes of like, you know, that it's easy to learn, hard to master, is like, okay, but when should I do what in what instance?
And it's like, that's the game.
That's literally the whole game. Like,
yeah. That's the sign to me. To me, the sign of a very well built game is something that's easy to pick up, but has a lot of depth to it, which I think is something that you're describing. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. This is our overview of the political track. We're going to be doing a heck of a lot more episodes on Song. I have a fully painted Lannister army now, so I got to get it onto the tabletop. Maybe one day I'll win a game against Brendan at some point, maybe. But hey,
I just dropped my first game in like months the other week.
Yeah, I mean, and we're getting we just got our campaign up at our LGS, and we've got a giant map of Westeros, which is super cool. And then check us out on the Discord, guys. Brendan is a mod on the Discord. He oversees our digital Westeros. So if you guys have questions for him, feel free to jump in there. Either list building questions on models, questions on release dates, questions with getting started. I mean, I think I've personally seen Brendan give over 30 demos of this game even this year. So this is a man that is all about educating others in terms of Song of Ice and Fire. So I guess with that, do you have any final closing thoughts for the folks of the internet here?
I mean, no. I mean, thank you for sticking with us. If you've come to the end of the video, I hope you guys enjoyed. Like Doug said, I'm on the Discord. Ping me literally anytime. You know, and I'll definitely get back to you.
Void bearable?
Volley bearable on the Discord. I think it actually just might be my name though. But that is my general
and
name.
Also your face.
I mean, if you just search,
it shows up as your cartoon avatar.
I mean, just look for the bearded guy with the hat. So
cool.
There he goes. He's like,
quick, get him. All right, cool. All right, everybody, we're signing off. Take it easy, everyone, and we'll see you next time on the planet. Say goodbye to everybody, Brendan.
Goodbye, everybody, Brendan.
Perfect. All right, cool. That was great.
Delicious.
Bendy! That's my note to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I got it. You got a poopy on the swords, my man. Hey guys, this is Doug. I'm back with Brendan, and today we're going to do a video on the political track for the miniatures game Song of Ice and Fire, made by Kumon. Hey guys, this is Doug. Sorry.
Yeah. Go on.
then I guess the next one, I just call it the swords. But this one, it
And-
says a friendly
Sorry,
unit.
Doug.
What's up?
Sorry. I'm really sorry. I need to take an intermission really quick. I need to run to the restroom.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
I mean, it's the magic of editing. Just don't bring the mic in with you. Nobody needs to hear you poop or pee.
I mean, are you sure?
That's true. But I mean, like, at least
No,
get paid for it.
I'm literally gonna turn it off, walk downstairs.
Just get
be right
get
back.
paid for it, you know?
Yeah, of
Put
course.
it on an OnlyFans. All right, yeah, that's fine. Doesn't matter.
All right,
I
be
mean,
right back.
the magic of editing doesn't fucking matter.
I have returned.
How was your poop?
Freeing is the best way I could put it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Once I put my headphones back on.
I also have another thing that I feel very strongly about, and I had
Yes.
this epiphany only last night. I told Chris McKinney, but I don't think he
Fully
gets it.
grasp. Yeah.
So
Please share.
here's my thought. I firmly believe that rechargeable AA batteries and AAA batteries specifically are a fugazi, because you buy them thinking, oh man, I'm gonna have these rechargeable AA's and I'm gonna put them in this really important piece of electronics that, like, you know, I'll always have battery because then when they go out, I'll charge them. You know, I'm never gonna get stuck without batteries. But
Yes.
nobody in their goddamn mind ever actually has charged batteries ready. So what you end up with is a mission critical piece of electronics that shits out on you. And instead of just having like a bag of AA's and just popping them in, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
these batteries are dead, and I don't have other batteries because I spent all this money on fucking rechargeable ones, and I thought that they were just going to work, and now I just have a dead keyboard or a dead mouse or like something I really need.
So I get that, but is that a failure of the product or is that a failure of the person?
It's a failure of the person, and I'm projecting my own failures onto these electronics that I
Doug,
have.
has that recently happened to you?
Yeah, it happened last night. I was really pissed off about it, honestly. All right. Anyway,